Good morning, everyone. Grab your cup of coffee. We're going to dive into immigration this morning. So, this was a piece that was written in the Free Press by Martin Gurry. He's the son of Cuban immigrants, came here as a child, used to work for the CIA, but obviously he is a legal immigrant himself. So, the title of this is What Both Sides Get Wrong About Immigration. So he starts off talking about the riots that are happening across the country. They've kind of tapered down a little bit, but earlier this month, there was a lot of riots in Los Angeles, New York City, those kinds of places. And he opens this piece up by talking about how deportation wasn't a display of bigotry, it was the law. If you wanted a share of American freedom and prosperity, you had to play by the process. And he notes that Barack Obama deported over 3 million illegal migrants and he is a president who has deported the most illegal migrants to date. That could obviously change with the current Trump administration, but up until present, Barack Obama is the individual who deported the most illegal migrants. This is really an interesting piece because this talking point isn't being acknowledged by folks who are advocating for illegal migration. They don't talk about the previous administration, prior administrations who were most, in the current zeitgeist, who would most politically / racially align with the current demands of the Democratic Party and those on the left. This individual deported most of the people, and they're not willing to acknowledge that, which I think is interesting. It's omission of facts in order to push a narrative about what is actually going on. He goes on to say that after watching the riots in Los Angeles, why did these people protesting, the migrants themselves possibly, wave the flags of the countries to which they were apparently desperate never to return? I think this is a really fundamental point that, again, isn't really being discussed. People aren't talking about why so many people are flowing. If you look at net migration globally, why so many people are flowing to certain parts of the world and not to others. So I pulled up some stats here. This is on Visual Capitalist. This is since the 1950s. You can go look this up yourself. If you parse the world up into different regions, Africa, Asia, Europe, Latin America, North America, and Oceania, which would include Australia, this is how migration flows have been happening. So there's been net outflows in Africa, net outflows in Asia, which I think in this case, Asia also includes Western Asia, which would be the Middle East. You have net inflows into Europe. You have outflows from Latin America and the Caribbean, which, as they know, Mexico is part of that category. Net inflows into North America, and then kind of negligible inflows into Australia and the rest of Oceania. So basically, people are leaving Africa, they're leaving Asia, they're leaving Latin America, and they're coming to Europe, and they're coming to North America. And if you want, you can go on the International Organization for Migration. This is a UN-sponsored group. They have put together this entire visualization of where people are leaving and where they're coming from. So people are leaving India, Mexico, Russia, Syria, China, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Ukraine, Philippines, Afghanistan, Venezuela, Poland. They're coming to places like the United States, Germany, Saudi Arabia, also going to Russia, the United Kingdom, France, UAE, Canada. So there's people who are leaving for a variety of reasons, right? Like people leaving from both Russia or Ukraine could be leaving because of the conflict there. People from Venezuela are leaving there because of a lot of violence and gang activity. Same with Mexico, with the cartels. So there's various reasons why people might leave from one place to another, but you'll notice a pattern here. Like people are consistently leaving from certain types of countries and they're coming to other types of countries, notably US and European countries. You can go through this yourself if you want. There's a whole mapping of where people are coming from if you're curious to learn more. That's interesting to think about because we're not really talking about that. Or when I say we, I mean the media. The media isn't really talking about that. People are leaving specific areas and they're coming here. And so if the United States is so bad, if Britain is so bad, if Europe is so awful, why are people flocking here? If the United States was truly this horrible, racist, misogynistic, oppressive place, people would be leaving the United States. And I'm not just talking about the one-off, people you see on TikTok or, like Ellen DeGeneres and Rosie O'Donnell who have left. I'm talking about en masse people would be leaving the United States because they don't feel safe here. Like, you hear this with, Zohran Mamdani just got nominated for the Democratic ticket for mayor in New York City, right? And so part of his platform is how evil capitalism is. He went on CNN and he talked about how awful capitalism is. If capitalism is so bad, if America is so bad, if the system that we have here, economic, political, social, however you want to look at it, is so bad, why are people staying here and why are people flocking to be here if it's so awful? So the flow of migration really shows that there's a demand. There's a demand for what America has to offer. There's a demand for Western culture, Western civilization. And that's why you're seeing a lot of inflow of people from other parts of the country. So he goes on to talk about the ICE raids and illegal immigration and how people who are coming to the country illegally labor under a double burden of alienation. They must navigate a foreign culture from the underworld of illegality. Their highest hope isn't citizenship, but invisibility. And their relationship to this country and its institutions can't possibly be one of love or gratitude, but only of fear. As with every illegal enterprise, criminals dominate the scene, preying on the weak. So what he talks about here, and again, this is something that isn't being acknowledged by people who are opposing the ICE raids and people who are supporting the illegal migrants, is that these people have been put into a precarious situation. They will never be legal citizens, right? The country has changed, the policy has changed such that if you're here illegally, you will no longer have the option to become a legal citizen in the future. That's why Pam Bondi and Kristi Noem and the folks in Washington are advocating people self-deport, because at least then you preserve your option of coming back legally in the future. But what has been happening, because people aren't coming here legally, they're not part of any sort of formal process to obtain citizenship. So citizenship may be an ideal, but it's not the ultimate goal at this moment. And so a lot of these people have been co-opted. And I wrote about this in a piece called Undocumented and Working in the Shadows. Basically, this, again, talks about some of the same themes. But what it really dives into is that migrants have to work illegally because they don't have the paperwork to get jobs, right? If you don't come here legally, you're not able to get a license, you're not able to get a social security number, you don't get a work permit. So you can't legally get a job. But at the same time, you've come here and you have to support yourself. Well, yes, aid organizations and the federal government and municipal governments have stepped in to provide housing and food and medical care. That's not infinite. And if you think it is, you're just creating an entirely new pool of welfare and welfare dependents that's outside of the existing welfare system. It's in parallel to it, and then expecting taxpayers to pay for it, and then rightfully so. People are upset about that. People are upset that people who came here illegally, committed a crime by coming here illegally outside of the formal process, have better access to housing than folks who have left the military and served their country and possibly dealing with PTSD and all sorts of stuff from the horrors of war that they saw. And so that is a hard square to circle. Like no one can square that. And so that creates a problem. So these people have to get jobs to be able to support themselves. And there's also the dignity piece of it too. Like you can sit in a hotel, you can sit in the Roosevelt Hotel all day long. Eventually you're going to get bored. I think that happens with most people. So if you can't get a job, even if all your baselines are paid for, even if you don't have to worry about healthcare and food and housing, all that stuff, you're going to get bored. And so that's going to naturally push people to look for activities. And if you can't participate in society because you're not here legally, you're going to have to create a shadow society in which you can participate in. And often the shadow society is dominated by illegals. So I would actually, if you're interested, I would read this because it also talks about how I think this is going to relate back to AI and how AI is going to disrupt things. But essentially, folks are coming in illegally and they're being co-opted to participate in a shadow economy. And and the shadow economy has different facets to it. A lot of it is criminal. And so what's happening is you have people who are coming over. They can't afford to pay the coyotes to get them over. So they're in debt once they get here. And this has been documented. Local news organizations have interviewed folks who are here illegally. They have cards in their pockets with bank account information and names of folks probably in the cartel, right? Human trafficking is big business for them. So folks in the cartel that they owe money to. So they have to work to pay back their debts. This is mafia style debt repayment. There's no surprise here. And so some of these people actually work through the cartels and work through the shadow system of work. And they do get legal papers, right? They'll get a social security number. Maybe they'll get a work document, but it's all forged or it's stolen. So on the one hand, you have people who are being exploited by the system, because they think they're getting legal paperwork and they're not, and they don't really know what's happening. They have to work through all these shadow intermediaries to get their jobs. But at the same time, you have average Americans whose social security numbers are being taken. And that's going to screw a lot of things up. Like, imagine if someone opened a credit card in your name. That would screw up your credit, right? So how does someone working under your social security number help at all? It doesn't. A lot of employers as well, and we're seeing this now that ICE raids have picked up and people are obviously being deported and fearful of kind of going to work. What the ICE raids show is you have a lot of employers who are dependent on illegal shadow migrant labor. Again, some people know this, some people are deliberately exploiting this, but some people don't because they're given legitimate documentation, even though it's a stolen social security number. Like, they also think they're following the process. So it creates this whole messy situation. But the people who are getting hurt the most are the migrants themselves, but also legal migrants. You have what's happening here is because employers can hire people off the books and under the table, you can, one, pay them a lower wage. You can pay them out of pocket, so you don't have to pay payroll taxes. There's an obvious cost savings there. And then two, because you know they're illegal, you have leverage over them. So you can force them to do work they don't want to do or work under bad conditions or for low pay because you hold that over them. So it's slavery 2.0. This is sanctioned slavery that folks on the left are defending, and it blows my mind. But it's also taking jobs away from Americans, and those include Americans who are born, raised here several generations. It also includes legal immigrants who migrated to this country and have become Americans. So I was reading an article, I saw it in another YouTube video. There was a meat processing plant, I think in Nebraska, or a farm or something along those lines. And it was raided, and obviously folks were taken away, and that created vacancies. Like, you can't stop operations, right? And so there was a flood of people who flocked to this place applying for work because all of a sudden jobs opened up. So this idea that people don't want to work, while that might be true for certain parts of the country, certain socioeconomic classes, there are people who do want to work. Those people might look like me. Those people might be legal immigrants, but there are people who want to work, and they're being pushed out of the labor market because they're being forced to compete with illegal migrants who are driving the wage down. And if you want a corollary for proof of this, look at the deterioration of blue-collar factory work over time. I just finished reading a book about this, and it talks about factories in Indiana. And throughout the book, these people started at good paying middle class, $28 an hour plus overtime jobs. And as factories started shipping jobs overseas or to Mexico, the wages started dropping because these people, you either work for, you don't have any options. If your factory leaves, right, you need to look for a new job. Well, if the new job is willing to pay you $23 an hour, then you have to take that. Well, when that factory closes, you have to look for another job. Well, okay, this one's only going to pay you 18. So 18 is better than nothing. So over time, wages have declined, and you can see a direct correlation between competition with cheaper overseas labor or cheaper labor in Mexico and that competition with American workers here and how it's driven wages down. So the same thing is happening in food processing and construction and agricultural and other industries where Americans don't want to work. It's driving down wages for the people who do want to work those jobs. And a lot of times those people are legal immigrants who came here the right way. So all of this is hurting them. And because all of these people have to work outside of the legal framework of work, they're easily exploited not just by their employers, but by the cartels, right? And so we have an entire new mafia-style society that has created a shadow workforce for these people to be able to participate in. And it's not good. There's a lot of exploitation. Child trafficking is big that, again, no one on the left seems to want to talk about. And that, by the way, the New York Times has documented this. So this isn't like Amanda's making up a crazy MAGA conspiracy. No, the New York Times did an expose a couple of years ago. I want to say 2017, 2018 maybe. I could be wrong on those dates. But they talked about how children were being sponsored by uncles, which if you know anything about different cultures, those uncle and aunt can often be a loose term that doesn't denote actual biological familial relationships. It could be through marriage. It could be someone who's a member of the same clan. But the use of like cousins and extended family to denote family, it's not the same conception we have here. And so you have kids who are being sponsored by uncles that they may or may not actually be biologically related to. These kids come here, then they owe a debt, right? Same thing. You owe a debt to this person who sponsored you. And they were getting them jobs in factories making Cheetos or Cheerios, right? And so you have 13 to 17-year-olds who are skipping school, working 12-hour shifts, making Cheerios so you can go to the store and buy them to feed your kids. And it's just, there's obviously like the really bad trafficking stuff that's happening, but there's also employment trafficking. So maybe they're not being physically abused, but they're certainly being psychologically and emotionally and employment-wise. It's child labor 2.0. So the very things that the left wants to be in support of workers, but they're supporting exploitation, human trafficking, and slavery 2.0 in their own country. So if you can make the logic work here, by all means, please debate me on this, argue with me on this, but I can't make the logic work. And I think the creation of a shadow system, a shadow society, a shadow economy is very dangerous because it gives criminals a greater foothold into the country. So he goes on to talk about how these people, because of all of this, they've become dependent on a remote and arbitrary bureaucracy. Again, these are the people who are funding the housing at the Roosevelt Hotel, FEMA, nonprofits. Like, you become dependent on all these organizations now. And then there's a whole insidious industry here in the poverty complex that I'm not going to dive into, but maybe in the future I think it's worth talking about. The people who help these people create a dependency cycle where the recipients become dependent on the providers and the providers become dependent on the recipients for their job security. So there's this like insidious relationship here where the people are incentivized to create dependence because the moment you solve problems like homelessness, the moment illegal migrants no longer need you, you no longer have a job. And so that's a gross perversion of, charity and aid that is a topic for another day. But I definitely think that is part of this as well. He raises an obvious point, like the logic of open borders policy is self-refuting. At some point, a limit might be reached. And obviously, like, you have to take it to the logical extreme. There's 8 billion people in the world. All 8 billion people cannot live in the United States. And they don't all want to, which is fine. But you need to have limits on immigration because at some point, if you become overrun, as we're seeing in cities like New York or LA, they don't have the municipal resources to take care of you. Like, LA is bankrupt. So I don't know how they're going to keep paying for these people beyond taxing the citizens that already live there. And then obviously that creates a huge problem, especially if a lot of legal immigrants live in Los Angeles, came the right way, are paying taxes, and you want to turn around and take more taxes from them to subsidize people who cheated the system. Like, that's just a no-go for a lot of people. Okay, So he frames this as there's kind of two sides to this. So on the left, the illegality is a test of anti-racist virtue. So all of this has been shaped in a racial lens and around racism, whereas folks on the right are looking at it as an invasion that, if needed, needs to be repressed militarily. And, you know, there are obvious credentials to both sides. Like, yeah, there is a racial element to it. You don't see a lot of Europeans fleeing to the country illegally and trying to settle here. Not to say that's not happening, but you're not seeing that. But then also on the right, you do have crime that is coming to places that didn't used to have, where the illegal migrants are being brought to. You're seeing that crime come up. There's a whole new, I didn't know this. I was watching a video of a new crime ring in Montana where folks are dressing up like DoorDash delivery drivers and Amazon drivers. They're casing houses to see who's home and who's not, and then breaking into them and stealing from them. And I didn't know this. Montana seems like a really nice place. What they're doing is there's a corridor, the drug corridor goes up through Montana. So you're seeing a lot of, I don't want to say like a lot, like there's a ton, but you're seeing a rise in criminal activity in places like Colorado and Idaho and Montana, and that's correlated to drugs and the flow of drugs and the cartels and their operations in the United States. So places that you wouldn't expect to see that kind of criminal activity, it's now popping up. And so people in that part of the country, if you don't know, there's a lot of historically it's been anti-government, self-reliant. So I could reasonably see why people would want a heavy-handed response to all this, because they do see the rise of these migrant communities, the rise of violence, gang, cartel activity, and obviously they don't want that. And so you can see both sides to this. And so he brings up the point. Obviously, you can't invite everyone, so we need optimal limits. Once the need to restrain immigration is acknowledged, the next step should be to seek consensus on the practicalities, i.e. the maximum number the country can absorb each year, the skills we most urgently need to import, and of course, the most transparent and fair process for those arriving. Now, every country has immigration policies, and for obvious reason, not everyone who comes into a country is wanted, needed, or desired. So just to give you, so there's the economic piece, right? You don't want too many low-skilled people who come into the country because they become dependent on the country's welfare program that other people are paying into, other citizens are paying into. And that drains resources and it diverts attention away from exactly this, right? We're diverting attention away from solving the problem of legal migration in order to accommodate the immediate survival needs of those who have illegally migrated here. But there's also a cultural piece to this as well. Like, Saudi Arabia is a Muslim country. Saudi Arabia does not want an influx of Christians coming into their country because it will change the character of the country. It will undermine their rule of law based on Sharia law. It will undermine their religion and all of everything that's based on that, right? So they're going to have limits on who can come into their country. They're not just going to open their border and be like, okay, Christians, come on in, convert everyone. Like, no, that's never going to happen. Same with China. China's a communist country. It has a dual state-run, but also quasi-capitalist system. They're not going to be like, okay, free enterprise people, come on in. That's going to subvert their governance, the CCP's control on power, that kind of thing. So there's logical reasons for putting in protocols that limit who gets to come into which countries and why. And so high-demand countries like Europe, like countries in Europe, like the United States, obviously have to have certain protocols. Like, we're not going to necessarily have a religious protocol in place, but a country like Saudi Arabia definitely would. And so it's going to vary country by country, but that's the point. You get to decide what your immigration laws look like. But if we're not having these conversations, we're not like putting in the laws that need to be put in to make sure that the optimal limits are hit. So he talked about, like, he arrived here in when he was a child brought from Cuba. And he argues that we have to turn our attention from illegal immigration to legal immigration, and that a clean line must be drawn between legal and illegal migrants, and that can only be done if we simplify and clarify legality. And I obviously didn't immigrate to the United States. I was born and raised here. I've been here for several generations. So if you have come here and migrated here, please like add your thoughts to this. But my understanding is it's very complex. There's obviously people who come here as students and they overstay their student visas. There are people who come here on work visas and they have to be employed in order to stay here. I think there's special ones for like startup founders if you're in like a high demand tech field. There's green cards, so you can like marry someone who's here. There's like a lottery system. There's all sorts of different ways people can come here, and I think it can be confusing and complex. And before Trump, even during the Obama administration, I remember this, like the conversation really was about legal immigration. We needed to solve that problem because there was clearly an issue of illegal migration, people coming into the country illegally. You have a lot of, demand at the southern border. I think there was kids and that kind of thing were coming here. So you need to solve immigration, right? But because we've changed the conversation from immigration to migration, we're ignoring the immigration piece. So we need to get back to talking about that. And as he argues here, simplify and clarify what it means to be here legally, how you do it, and what it means to be here illegally. That seems pretty rational. This is a really great point that he makes here. The people acting out in the streets of LA were no longer Mexicans or Salvadorans, yet could never be Americans. The people who are coming here illegally are now in a purgatory of sorts. Like they have rejected and left their country of origin, and they are coming here. I'm sure many are trying to start as normal of a life as possible, but they will never be Americans. They will never be Americans. And he goes on, the reason why is because legal immigration typically ends in assimilation. And that is the end point. If you immigrate to a country, your goal isn't just to live there. It's to become a citizen of that country. There's a difference between being an expat and being an immigrant, right? There are lots of expats. There are a lot of Americans living in Spain and Italy and places all over the world, right? Those people are still Americans. They may be living in another country, but they are Americans. They haven't denounced or left their country of origin. They've just left their they've just changed their geographic physical location. And so there's no need to assimilate. You can adopt some of the culture, right? But there is no need to assimilate to that culture. The point of immigration is that you are severing the bond you had with your home country and you are joining a new country. So you need to assimilate. And I think a really good example of this process is in Israel. So Israel has a well-established immigration program. Anyone who has Jewish ancestry can go on Aliyah and immigrate into Israel, right? You might keep some of your culture if you're an Ukrainian, Russian, whatever. You might keep your culture, but you don't necessarily keep your citizenship. And you might choose, there are certain cases where you might choose to, but if you're performing Aliyah, you are leaving your country of origin, you are becoming an Israeli, right? You are assimilating into that culture, a culture, where your Jewish identity is prominent. And there's certainly the cultural melting pot from where different groups of Jews come from. But the end goal is the state of Israel in and of itself is the end goal, and you become an Israeli. And I think that's a really interesting example because you do see you have a very established process for immigration there. That some other countries, I think Ireland has like that ethnic-based immigration, and I think Germany as well. But countries like that, you really do see there is a process for people who want to purposefully move to that country and assimilate into the culture. What is happening with illegal migration is that this process of assimilation isn't happening. So this gets back to what he's saying here before. You're no longer a Mexican or Salvadoran, but you're not an American either. So you're somewhere in between. And what happens is because you can't become an American, you create, again, a shadow society where you can flourish. And facts on the ground, so demographics, determine what that society looks like. Over time, little little Mexico here becomes all of Los Angeles. And I think that's what we're seeing. We're seeing now. If you scroll through X, you can see videos of there's things that it looks like it kind of feels reminiscent of COVID. Like just things have really shut down because people aren't going out as much, and people are being like, wow, the absence of migrants really shows how many lived here. And so you create a new society within the United States. You're not melting together, and you're not necessarily celebrating your heritage. And then that's why you're seeing all these flags coming up. The flags are, in this regard, are symbolic of that. I mean, I remember growing up in upstate New York, you had a lot of Scottish and Italians, right? Irish. You go to any East Coast kind of Rust Belty, like factory town, right? And you'll see a lot of this. And yeah, you would see, I remember like the Hibernians would perform during the parades, and they would have their bagpipes and their kilts and stuff, and they would have their clan flag, right? But they didn't have there wasn't like a claim to Scottish, like a citizenship, or, you would have the Italian American society or the Ukrainian, there was a big Ukrainian church in my hometown. So like you would see all of that, but it was always hyphenated American, or, they would offer things, but it wasn't like you didn't really see people like waving the flags of their country of origin the way you're seeing it used now. It might have been something that you would see it occasionally, but not like you're seeing now. You wouldn't, a church might fly it, but really it was, you're an American, you're an Ukrainian, you're at a Ukrainian American church. This is a Ukrainian American bank. This is the Italian American Society. These are the Hibernians who are of Scottish ancestry, but they're not like waving a flag of Scotland. Like, I hope that makes sense. The way people express their hyphenated identities and their ethnic backgrounds and where they came from was very different than how it's happening now. Those people had assimilated and become part of America and the larger melting pot. This feels like, honestly, neocolonialism. You have groups of people within the country who are expanding because they are the nodes of the shadow society that has been forming. So naturally, they're going to attract other people to come join their community. And so you're seeing these nodes of illegal migrants forming in different communities across the country. And they're isolated. They're outside of America because they aren't Americans. They haven't assimilated, but they're physically here. And for some reason, they still feel an affinity to the country they fled. And so there's like an allegiance to that in some ways. They still feel pride. And this is what's really interesting to me. So you have lots of people who fled Iran after the 70s. Almost all my professors in school were Iranians whose families fled after the revolution. You have a lot of Armenians, right, in Los Angeles particularly, who've families fled and that kind of thing. You have communities like that all over the country. I don't see any of them like flying the flag of the countries they fled. An Armenian that was persecuted in Turkey isn't flying a Turkish flag. An Iranian who fled the revolution isn't waving Iran's current flag that represents its theocratic government, right? So if you, again, what I was saying before, if you hate your country of origin so much, why are you waving the flag? Why are you so obsessed with symbols and identity and affinity for a country that you have obviously left? And this gets to the assimilation. If you're not assimilating, that's what happens. If the end point isn't assimilation, they're never going to fly the American flag. They're never going to say the Pledge of Allegiance, which means they're not going to respect our laws. The Constitution means nothing to them. The Declaration of Independence means nothing to them. And that's why this whole conversation is really important, because we're seeing the left trying to protect the rights of illegal migrants by changing the interpretation of our laws and our Constitution and using lawfare to promote their perception of what those rights are. You saw this with the Kilmar Abrego Garcia case. You're seeing it with the injunctions to stop ICE raids at lower courts. You're seeing the subversion of the rule of law to illegal migrants for people who will never become Americans. And that should be deeply concerning to anyone who is a citizen of this country, whether you were born here, whether you immigrated here legally. If you call this country home and you believe in the Constitution and the laws manifested in it, any group of people that seeks to undermine the promises made in those documents and our rule of law in our society in order to benefit people who came here illegally, who are never going to become American citizens, who have no desire to become American citizens, and still hold an affinity to their country of origin. Like, that is, I mean, if not a military, that certainly is a cultural invasion. How do you square that circle there? And so that's what he gets at with the assimilation piece, which is really important. So again, this guy, Cuban immigrant, came here as a child, right? But also went through the process, fled communism in Cuba, settled here. And I think this is a really good piece because it's coming at it from the perspective of someone who did legally migrate here. And yeah, obviously as a child, his parents helped him through the process, but he's an example of someone who fled a country, severed ties with that country, became an American, and he's a former CIA analyst, so he served the country. Like, he served his new adopted country proudly. And I think this is a common story for a lot of immigrants who come here. They're excited to come here. There's opportunity here. They understand the promise that America has, and they want to participate in that. And I think he's pretty spot on that, if we don't solve the assimilation problem, we're going to have a much bigger problem. If we don't give people options, if we don't figure out the legality, right? People aren't going to assimilate here. We're going to have cultural competition, which we're already seeing played out in the court system. We're going to see the emergence of, obviously, this is happening, parallel shadow societies and economic systems, because these people can't participate in the ones that exist. And then it's going to hurt the people who are born here and the people who come here legally, the citizens of this country, because they can't compete. The rule of law, if it no longer serves a citizen, if they cannot get jobs, housing, I didn't even talk about that, but all these people have to live somewhere. So once they leave, the Roosevelt Hotel in New York, where are they going? Well, they're taking housing. I was reading a book, that same book I was reading too. I haven't dived into this, so if you have experience with this, please share. But I was talking about how a Mexican family that had been brought to Indiana to train, because the company the factory that was being dismantled was being sent to Mexico. So this person was coming here, was in the process of legally immigrating. But how buying a house and fixing it up was a symbol for the immigration process to signify your intent to set roots and be part of a community here. So I don't know to what extent that is happening. But if that's true, if housing is a core part of the immigration process, or at least like a performative part to show your intent to become a citizen and resident here and establish roots, it makes me wonder how many single family homes have been used and renovated for that purpose, for the purpose of someone establishing themselves as a citizen here. And then if that is happening, are there local communities where American citizens have been displaced by illegal migrants who are purchasing homes under the table, fixing them up, and kind of trying to establish themselves here? And I don't know anything about that. So if you do, please leave the comments. I would be curious, though, to dive more into that. Anyways, I think this is a really good piece. It's worth reading in its full. Again, it's called What Both Sides Get Wrong About Immigration. If you like this video and got value from it, please subscribe and help me grow this channel. All right, I'll see you in the next video.